Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video. My name is Tilly and I'm a strength and conditioning coach. So if you have watched any of my other videos, you may have got the idea that I have an affinity for strength and power sports. And yes, that is true. I just find them so interesting and I love the unique challenges that they pose. But with that being said, I have been accused of perhaps hating cardio, and I don't. I don't hate cardio at all. I think everyone should do it. And with that being said, today we're going to be talking about concurrent training. And that essentially means strength training at the same time as endurance training. However, today we're going to be talking about this with the focus being on endurance performance. I'm speaking right to you endurance athletes. I want to tell you how you can best plan your resistance training so that your goal of improved endurance remains the top priority. Forget the strength right now. Forget the weightlifters. Forget everything else. Today is about you. And as always, guys, before we get into it, please make sure to like and subscribe. It'll mean you get to stay up to date with some really cool sports science discussions. I'll teach you how to program, and it would just be wonderful to have you in this little community. Now, endurance athletes can usually get away with concurrent training to a higher extent than strength and power athletes can. Another way of saying this is that endurance athletes usually get benefits from doing strength training alongside their endurance training. However, strength and power sport athletes usually end up with a compromised ability to perform as a result of that concurrent endurance training. You can see this here in this graph where endurance athletes who are concurrently training make about the same adaptations as those who are just endurance training. On the other hand, you can see in the strength block, those who just do the resistance training perform better than those concurrently training. I would probably argue though that endurance athletes who do train strength training would outperform those just doing endurance training in the long term. And this is because they'd be getting benefits from the resistance training, and these would be things like increased rate of force development, increased strength and injury prevention, and improvements in running economy, helping them to run faster and for longer. The main concern for endurance athletes when you concurrently train is that if we don't program it correctly, when we do resistance training, it can cause a large amount of fatigue, and this could cause a suboptimal endurance performance. Some researchers have actually termed this phenomenon RTSEP. This stands for resistance training induced suboptimization of endurance performance. In this video, I'm not really going to talk about the physiology as to why all of this happens. We're going to be talking about practical ways to improve your programming so that you can include your resistance training but without compromising on the priority of endurance. I found these recommendations in one amazing paper that I have linked down below. It's like a summation of the current guidelines, and it includes all of the practical applications of a wide range of research. I found an open access version for you, so if anything I'm saying to you is interesting or you want to know more, then go ahead and check that out. Now, let's dive into it. So the first section, we're going to be talking about how we can minimize fatigue when endurance training is done on the same day as resistance training. So this is for athletes doing 2 sessions in one day, endurance and resistance. The first point is to ensure at least 6 hours of recovery after resistance training. And this is if we're going to undertake low to moderate endurance training. We would also ensure at least 6 hours of recovery if the resistance training that we're doing is fast contractions or slow eccentric movements. So slow on the way down or fast and powerful movements. We would ensure 9 hours of recovery in between that endurance and resistance session if we're doing typical contraction velocities in our resistance training. So that means we would do our exercises at a normal pace, nothing particularly fast and nothing particularly slowly. And we would do this again if we're doing low to moderate endurance training. And that just means below the anaerobic threshold. One really important point is that we want to minimize cross-training for single mode endurance athletes. This means that if you're doing resistance training and endurance training on the same day, if you are a cyclist, your endurance training session should be cycling. You would do this rather than running or rowing because it'll help to minimize that fatigue. If you are a multimodal endurance athlete, so you're a triathlete, then the recommendation is that you opt for endurance training that is not running because that is the most taxing. Again, if you're a triathlete, that means that you would do swimming or cycling instead as that endurance training session. And the last recommendation for same day endurance and resistance training is that you avoid doing high intensity endurance training on that day. Anything above that anaerobic threshold or training at a high percentage of your VO2 max or really high heart rate demands, you want to kind of leave for another day. Now, the next section, we're going to be talking about how to minimize fatigue for endurance training when it's done on a separate day to the resistance training session. The first recommendation is that we try and aim for a low to moderate endurance training. So that's the intensity that we want to work with when we're training the day after the resistance training session. And this is even if that resistance training is at a low intensity. And the researchers here have defined low intensity resistance training as anything less than 80% of your 1 rep max. If you're in a period of time where doing high intensity endurance training is of particular importance, then we want to try and leave at least 48 hours in between that resistance training session and the high intensity endurance training. And this is particularly the case if that resistance training is those fast movements or the slow movements. In that same respect, we would still incorporate at least 48 hours of recovery time if we're doing that low to moderate intensity endurance training after that moderate to high intensity resistance training. So at least 48 hours after we've done a resistance training session at around or above 80% of our 1 rep max. And again, this is resistance training at typical contraction velocities, so just normal speeds of movement. We would expand this rest time even further to 72 hours of recovery if we needed to do high intensity endurance training the day or so after that moderate to high intensity resistance training. And this kind of recovery time would be the same if we were doing high load resistance training days, so like hypertrophy and things like that. Anything that's going to get that volume load very high. The researchers have actually said here that high load is over 20,000 kilos at typical contraction velocities, which seems to me to be a little high for endurance runners or anyone really, like other than weightlifters. So I don't know. So that was for endurance training on a separate day to resistance training. Those are the recommendations in terms of rest and recovery, minimizing fatigue. So for this part of the video, we're going to be talking about how to minimize fatigue for endurance training the day after we do same day resistance and endurance training. So this would be for the day after we have those 2 sessions, like I mentioned at the beginning. First and foremost, if endurance training is the priority, we're going to perform endurance training first on that day that we have 2 sessions. Ideally, we want to be getting at least 9 hours of recovery in between those 2 sessions on the same day, and that's particularly the case if we're going to be doing low to moderate endurance training the next day. Another thing to consider is that we probably want to avoid high intensity endurance training the day after our 2 sessions, and that's irrespective of the original order of those 2 sessions. And similar to that first set of protocols I mentioned, we want to avoid that cross training for the single mode endurance athletes. So if you're a cyclist, don't go running. If you're a rower, don't go swimming. If you are a multimodal endurance athlete though, we want to try and minimize running on the day after we have those 2 sessions because running causes a lot of fatigue. So if you're a triathlete, go for a cycle or a swim the day after those 2 sessions. Oh wow, I hope that was kind of interesting, but that's all of the recommendations in this particular paper. It's just about how to structure your training week. I hope you guys have understood what I'm trying to get across, and I hope it's just caused you to think a little bit about your own programming to see if it meets those kind of requirements. If you're an endurance athlete and you're wanting to add in resistance training, it's really important that we consider the resistance training as a total part of the training volume. So you don't want to just stack it on top. If you say that your week is going to be 10 sessions, then you don't want to add like an 11th session of resistance training in. You want to make resistance training a part of those 10 sessions so that you can adequately recover, minimize fatigue, and perform your best. I'm really excited to hear what you guys think, and if you've made it this far into the video, thank you for watching, and I truly hope you have the most amazing week ahead. If you're training this week, I'd love to hear if you implement any of these new recommendations. As a final note, guys, please remember to like and subscribe. It would be awesome to have you here as a part of this little community. I would just be thrilled. See you guys. I'll see you next time. Bye.